On that crisp morning, Liberty's residents crowded around the weathered courthouse steps. An old homestead with 12 acres of prairie land faced the auction block. The opening bid, a mere 12 cents, whispers rippled through the assembly before. Silence descended like a heavy blanket. Nobody stirred. The prosperous merchants and successful cattle barons remained motionless as carved stone. Only one figure moved, Gideon Hale, a weathered cowpoke in dirt-caked clothing, gradually lifted his weathered hand. 12 cents, his gravelly voice declared. All faces swiveled toward him, yet their expressions held sympathy rather than jealousy, as though he'd voluntarily entered a snare with no escape route. "Any higher offers?" the auctioneer shouted, his call bouncing awkwardly through the crowd. Silence answered him. The hammer fell with a decisive bang. The homestead now answered. To Gideon Hale, during his journey home on horseback. Gideon sensed those penetrating stares following him like ghostly warnings. Stay away from that place. Yet Gideon possessed nothing more to risk. A 12-cent property with acreage, a water source, and a weathered barn sufficient to begin anew with his meager cattle stock. The dusty trail wound through scattered timber. Beyond the trees, the homestead's entrance stood quietly amid towering weeds. Gideon tugged his reins, his spirit dropping. A figure dangled from the gateway. An Apache woman hung there. Yet this was no ordinary woman. She towered above any man Gideon had encountered. Broader shoulders, limbs so lengthy they nearly grazed the earth, despite hanging from the crossbeam. Dirt and crimson stained her features. Eyes remained partially open, searching desperately. For ergot, Gideon gripped his blade tighter and approached the entrance swiftly. His 12-cent bargain was unveiling mysteries. More frightening than any rumor had suggested. What emotions would surge through you witnessing such a sight? Share your thoughts in the comments section. His sharp steel sliced through the hemp cleanly. Her massive frame dropped like a toppling oak, forcing Gideon backward as his knees hit the soil.
Ow.
Though accustomed to wrestling untamed steers across open ranges, he'd never supported the full mass of someone built with such raw power and sinew. She remained motionless on the parched grass, drawing ragged breaths, her wide chest rising and falling as if it might explode. Gideon ripped fabric from his worn shirt and bound the bloody rope marks around her throat. His fingers shook slightly, whether from exertion or the strangeness of cradling such tremendous life force.
Out on there, girl.
Gideon whispered roughly, his voice like stones grinding underfoot. Her obsidian eyes flickered open deep and blazing with rage and suffering. She attempted speaking in her native tongue, incomprehensible to him, yet he understood that expression, desperate plea for survival. He reached for his leather water flask and let several drops touch her parched lips. Her throat contracted weakly, and her breathing began stabilizing. Gideon knelt beside her, glancing toward the homestead entrance where rope fibers still marked the timber. Dried blood streaked the weathered gray planks, evidence left as a warning for anyone foolish enough to venture near. He cursed quietly. This 12-cent property was no fortune, it was a death trap. As evening shadows lengthened, Gideon carried the woman inside. The small wooden structure was thick with neglect, windows sealed with boards, though the flooring remained solid and cold embers filled the stove. It didn't feel abandoned for 15 years, as town gossip claimed. He placed her on a rough wooden table and draped a blanket across her frame. In the quiet, Gideon examined her face. She wasn't unknown to him. He'd heard tales at trading outposts. Naeli, descendant of Chief Whitehawk, bearing warrior heritage, standing tall as legends described. Yet why was she suspended at this homestead's entrance? And who possessed such cruelty to treat an Apache chief's descendant this way? Gideon walked onto the porch, peering into the diminishing light. At the forest's boundary, a mounted figure waited. The man sported a broad hat decorated with silver that captured the dying sunbeams. He neither advanced nor retreated, just observed like a sentry. When their gazes locked, the rider wheeled around and disappeared among the trees. Cold fear crawled down Gideon's spine. The townspeople had regarded him with pity. This homestead contained more than misfortune. Someone was observing, waiting, and now he'd rescued a living witness from death's grip. Inside, Naeli stirred. Her voice emerged, rough and barely audible. But one English word broke through. Danger. They will return. Gideon clenched his work-hardened hands. This worn-out cattle rancher never sought involvement in another's conflict.
Yet with a 12-cent homestead and a dying warrior woman now under his protection.
Understood his peaceful days had ended. That evening, sleep eluded Gideon. Within the cramped cabin, flickering flames from the wood stove painted shadows across cracked timber walls. The massive Apache woman lay beneath blankets, occasionally moaning, her eyes opening and closing. Each movement made the old bed groan, as if it might collapse. Gideon remained beside her, his Winchester within arm's reach. He'd grown familiar with prairie predators, cattle rustlers, and endless solitary nights under starlight. Yet now, a different uneasiness pounded behind his skull. Who would hang a giant woman at an entrance like some twisted display? And why had the entire town remained silent? At sunrise, Gideon knew he must venture into town. Nayeli required medical supplies, fresh water, and clean dressings. He secured her inside, locked the door, and took the dirt pathway back to Liberty. Entering the general store, strange tension filled the atmosphere. Conversations halted. Several ladies pretended examining cloth while their eyes darted toward him. Gideon approached the counter directly and produced some coins from his pocket. Need bandages, antiseptic, and provisions. The shopkeeper, a thin man with unsteady hands, quietly gathered supplies without speaking. He placed the package on the counter and whispered, barely above silence, "The homestead." At Crow's Gate? Gideon nodded slowly. The entire store seemed to suspend breathing. An elderly woman dropped her sewing basket, thread spools scattering across wooden planks. Suddenly the rear door opened. A tall figure entered, his wide hat with silver trim catching light. The same rider Gideon had spotted watching from the forest edge. His stare was sharp as steel, his calloused palm near his weapon's grip. "Fletcher Knox," he introduced himself, voice smooth as polished timber. "Heard you made quite an interesting purchase." Gideon remained silent, offering only a brief nod. His steel-gray eyes cold. Fletcher dropped a leather pouch onto the counter with a heavy thud. The unmistakable sound of metal coins within. $500, thousands more than your investment. Transfer the homestead to me tonight. The store went deathly still. The shopkeeper flinched, dropping a glass jar of preserves that shattered across the floor. Everyone present understood what that homestead represented. Now they awaited Gideon's response. Gideon's grip tightened on the saddle strap across his shoulder. His steely gaze locked onto Fletcher. $500 for a rotting shack? You must be purchasing something else entirely. Fletcher smiled, but it was cold as forged iron. I'm buying your common sense. That homestead isn't for someone who values longevity. In that moment, Gideon heard fearful murmurs surrounding him. Fletcher's words weren't merely a warning, they were a death sentence delivered plainly to his face. When Gideon reached the homestead, sunset already painted the distant peaks. He carried a heavy sack while Fletcher Knox's icy warning echoed in his thoughts. His horse snorted softly as they neared the entrance, the same spot where a body had dangled just yesterday. Gideon glanced upward. The rope was gone, but dried. Blood still marked the wood. Chills ran down his spine. Inside, the stove's flames cast golden light across the cabin's timber walls. Nayeli, the giant Apache woman, was conscious. She sat against the wall, her deep black eyes focused on Gideon. In the dim illumination, her full form was visible broad warrior shoulders. Lengthy arms, powerful muscles marked with bruises, a fierce combination of raw beauty and brutal strength. "You rescued me," she said, her English fractured but understandable. Gideon set down his supplies and poured her water. Couldn't bear watching any human treated like livestock. Nayeli drank deliberately, each sip measured. Then she spoke again, her words cutting the air like steel. "I am White Hawk's granddaughter, Apache chief. They captured me to force our people to surrender our territory. This homestead sends a message." Gideon frowned. "What message?" She nodded, her large hand gripping the blanket's edge. They suspended me at the entrance to make their point. This cabin once housed a white man named Samuel Hartwell. He discovered fraudulent land papers evidence that traders and officials had sold stolen ground. He concealed the proof here, and they murdered him. Gideon felt her words settle in his chest like ash, and those documents might remain here. Nayeli surveyed the room, her gaze drifting toward the wooden floor's center. Unknown, but they believe so. And me, I was merely a hostage to keep the tribe quiet. Outside, wind howled through rotting boards, carrying distant sounds of hammering. Someone was establishing camp nearby. Gideon peered through the narrow window opening and spotted horse shadows moving through darkness. Fletcher hadn't been bluffing. He'd sent men to observe. Gideon turned back, meeting her eyes. In those obsidian depths, fire had returned, not the hopeless flicker of dying spirit, but the blaze of Apache warrior blood. "You saved me," Nayeli said, her voice stronger. "Oh, you must fight beside me, otherwise we'll both end up hanging at that entrance." Gideon clenched his jaw, his hand instinctively finding his rifle's grip. He was merely a weary rancher seeking quiet refuge with his scrawny herd. Yet now this 12-cent homestead had become a gateway into a tempest of bloodshed and flame. "Thank you for joining me," he said. "If this tale awakens something within you, memories of bygone days, dusty twilights, the echo of hoofbeats pounding in your heart, please subscribe to my channel so we can gather again daily. I'll share another Western story." Night descended swiftly like velvet drapes drawn across the prairie. Gideon sat by the window, Winchester across his knees, eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the entrance. The stove's fire had diminished, leaving only faint embers casting Nayeli's shadow against the cracked timber wall. She now sat upright fully, her eyes glowing in darkness like flames refusing extinction. From the distance came hoofbeats, heavy, measured, and rhythmic like funeral drums. Gideon squinted. Silhouettes lined the ridge. Torches blazed bright, and wind carried harsh laughter. Then a voice rang out, cold as steel. "Gideon Hale, emerge, and speak like a man. The cabin isn't yours." Fletcher Knox stepped from shadows, silver-trimmed hat gleaming in firelight. Behind him stood nearly 12 riders, weapons at their sides. Eyes gleaming like hunting predators, Gideon opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He didn't conceal his rifle, but held it firmly, his stare icy. "Rather late for a social call, isn't it?" Fletcher released a dry laugh, his voice echoing across the clearing. "I offered 500 for that cabin. My proposal's expired. What we need lies inside that house. Surrender it, and you still depart breathing." Nayeli appeared behind Gideon, towering like a specter in the firelight. Even wrapped in her old blanket, she stood tall and unwavering. The mounted men recoiled. The image of a woman once suspended at the entrance, now standing proudly on the porch like a curse risen from death. "You attempted to murder me." Her voice came rough, but powerful. "Because I know the truth. But my blood won't purchase your peace." Fletcher narrowed his eyes, his hand moving halfway to his pistol before lowering it slowly. "Tough woman, but you see, Gideon, you're harboring a wounded wolf. She's dragging you into a massacre. Release her, step aside, and preserve your life." Gideon turned toward Nayeli. In that instant, he saw something in her eyes. Not fear, but faith. A solitary rancher, a giant Apache woman, two outcasts standing against a pack of predators. He spat in the dirt. "I purchased this homestead. It belongs to me, and anyone who harms this woman will pay in blood." Silence stretched taut like a drawn bowstring. Then came the cold rattle of metal as Fletcher raised his hand, signaling his men. Rifles emerged from holsters, catching torchlight. Gideon stepped back, pulling Nayeli inside. His voice dropped low. "Take that revolver. Tonight we fight." Outside, hoofbeats thundered louder. The field around the cabin erupted in flames. The storm had arrived. Heavy pounding on the wooden door sounded like a coffin being sealed. Then came the first volley of bullets screaming through air, tearing holes through cabin walls. Wood splinters flew like sparks. Gideon tackled Nayeli to the floor as his Winchester roared back, blasting one attacker off the fence line. Gun smoke thickened the small cabin like fog. Each time Gideon fired, he heard curses and snarls from outside. They weren't holding back, they meant to drown the cabin in blood. Nayeli, though still weakened, clutched the Colt he'd given her. Her large hands trembled but remained steady as her fingers squeezed the trigger. Bang! Another man dropped at the entrance, his body falling exactly where she'd once hung. The cabin entrance had become a boundary marked in blood. Too many of them, Gideon growled, sweat and powder dust streaking his face. He flipped a wooden table as a barricade, reloading his Winchester. Outside, Fletcher's voice bellowed, "Burn it! Burn the cabin, and burn them with it." A torch sailed onto the dry straw roof. Flames burst skyward, golden light flickering in Nayeli's black eyes. She gritted her teeth, braced herself, and stood tall, her towering frame casting shadows over. "Gideon, they will not have this cabin," she declared, her voice clear but resolute. "And they will not have me." Just then, from across the prairie, a war horn blew low and deep like thunder rolling through hills. Beneath moonlight came silhouettes, hundreds of Apache riders from White Hawk's tribe. They formed a wall of horse and steel, their spears flashing, war cries ripping through night. Fletcher's men panicked. Some glanced back in terror as the tribe's full force stormed forward like a desert sandstorm. Fletcher cursed and drew his revolver, kicking his horse toward the cabin in desperation to finish before everything collapsed. But Gideon was ready. He stepped onto the porch as his Winchester fired, the bullet whistling past Fletcher's silver. Hat nearly unseating him, Nayeli stood beside him, a wall of muscle and fury, shouting in Apache. Her call was answered by thunderous voices as warriors closed around the cabin. A flaming arrow streaked through air, striking a torch in a mercenary's hand. It exploded into flame, fire consuming the fence line. Apache horses surged forward. Completing the circle, Fletcher yanked his reins to flee, but too late. The native riders moved like steel blades, enveloping his entire hired gang. Gideon stood on the burning porch, sweat and ash covering his face. Beside him, Nayeli loomed like a mountain shadow, her eyes blazing. They'd survived the night, but Gideon knew this was merely the beginning. The cabin's secret remained buried, and whoever controlled Fletcher would prove far more dangerous. Dawn painted the prairie crimson. Smoke still curled from the cabin roof, but flames had been extinguished by water buckets brought by the Apache tribe. Bodies of horses and fallen men lay scattered around the fence line. Air thick with gunpowder and scorched ash, Gideon sat slumped on porch steps, breathing heavily, his calloused hands still trembling from the blood-soaked night. Before him knelt Chief White Hawk, long silver hair flowing. Eyes aged but burning bright as he embraced Nayeli, the giant woman bowed her head. Her powerful arms clinging to her grandfather, tears mixing with soot and sweat as they streamed down her sun-darkened cheeks. "My granddaughter lives, but enemies will return," White Hawk said, his voice like low thunder. He looked Gideon in the eye. "This cabin hides something they want buried forever." Gideon turned his gaze to the scorched house. He remembered Nayeli's words from the previous night that Samuel Hartwell had hidden genuine documents. He stepped inside, kneeling on the smoke-stained floor. In the room's center, he noticed something unusual, a square patch of plank sealed tightly with black stone-hard resin. Here, Gideon whispered. White Hawk nodded and signaled. Two warriors stepped forward with axes. Heavy strikes echoed through the cabin, cracking resin, splitting wood. Finally, floorboards gave way, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Gideon reached in and withdrew a dusty iron chest and heavy leather pouch. When the lid creaked open, every eye focused on it. Inside were scrolls, land deeds, and government seals. Each paper bore familiar signatures. Judge William Crane, and beside it, a bold red stamp, Governor Marcus Webb. Nayeli clenched her jaw. They used forged documents, sold our tribal land to 10, 20 different buyers. Hartwell discovered this, tried exposing them, and they murdered him. Gideon examined more papers, payment ledgers, names of those who'd taken bribes, judges, sheriffs, even prominent ranch owners. The sums were massive, tens of thousands of dollars. The air grew heavy. Every word on those pages was a blade aimed at powerful throats across 3 counties. "Now you understand," Whitehawk said quietly. "Fletcher was merely a hound, the masterminds. Our Crane and Webb, they won't stop. They'll send soldiers, burn this place down, kill anyone who knows." Gideon clenched his fists. His 12-cent cabin had become a graveyard of secrets and a spark that could ignite an entire corrupt empire. He looked at Naeli, still shaking but proud, then to Whitehawk, his old eyes heavy with the stolen people's sorrow. "They wanted to silence you," Gideon said, voice hard as stone. "But now I know the truth too. And I swear this cabin will never be a grave again." That afternoon, prairie wind rose fierce and wild. Dark clouds gathered overhead, heralding an approaching storm. Gideon tightened saddle straps, Winchester slung over his shoulder, while Naeli and Apache warriors established defensive positions around the cabin. Everyone knew Crane and Webb's forces could arrive momentarily. The sound of hooves thundered. From the distant slough, relentless like rolling drums. Hundreds of riders appeared on the horizon, cloaks billowing, rifles glinting. At the front road, Judge William Crane, face hard as stone, flanked by Governor Webb's soldiers. They stopped at the cabin entrance. It's the same place where Naheli's body had once hung. Crane called out, his voice booming, hand over the iron chest. "And that Apache woman? And we'll spare your life? Gideon Hale, you're just a poor cowhand. Don't let 12 cents become your tomb." Gideon stepped onto the porch, eyes steady. He raised the stack of papers from the chest. "These documents are enough to hang both you and your governor. You think I'll bow down?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd of riders. Some shifted uneasily at Webb's mention. They too knew betrayal might soon turn on them. Crane snarled and shouted the attack order. Gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through air. The Apache responded with a storm of arrows and battle cries that shook the earth. The fight exploded at the cabin's entrance. Gideon dropped the first attacker, then felled the second. Naeli stood tall at the entrance, her powerful arms wielding the Colt with thunderous force, each shot like lightning cracks. Battle raged fiercely. Webb's riders faltered against the coordination of Gideon and the tribe. Confusion spread and many fled, leaving Crane alone. Still defiant, he charged toward the cabin, gun raised at Gideon. But Naeli was already there, blocking the entrance. Her massive hand swung up, knocking the pistol from Crane's grip. He collapsed in dirt, eyes wide as he stared at papers in Gideon's hand. "Justice comes," Gideon growled, his Winchester aimed squarely at Crane's chest. "No matter how many cabins you burn." Crane was bound and handed to the warriors. Evidence from the iron chest was delivered by Whitehawk and Gideon directly to the territorial marshal. 1 week later, Governor Webb and his accomplices were marched out in handcuffs before the public. News spread like wildfire. All 3 counties trembled. The 12-cent cabin was no longer a place of hanging, but a symbol of justice. Naeli, the chief's granddaughter, was hailed as one who returned from death. And Gideon, the once-forgotten rancher, became a hero not just for his steady aim, but because he'd chosen to stand with truth. Years later, when prairie winds whispered through grasslands, one could still see dim light glowing inside the cabin. Gideon sat on the porch, Naeli by his side, both quietly watching the old entrance. Where once hung a noose, now stood a wooden sign with one word: freedom. Now listen here. Out in that wild territory, a poor man spent just 12 cents to purchase a run-down cabin. Yet what he acquired wasn't wood or land, but the burden of an entire generation. A woman hung at the entrance. Blood-stained documents and truth the whole town feared. Sometimes life resembles that 12-cent cabin. You think you're buying a cheap place to rest, but you walk straight into a tempest. You believe you're choosing something small for yourself. The fate demands you stand for something far greater. Gideon was merely a rough old rancher, unnoticed by most, yet when he cut the rope from that Apache woman's neck, he didn't just save a life, he saved what remained of his own humanity. Sometimes one small act of courage is all it takes to spark the path to justice. And that, perhaps, is the greatest truth this story holds. Justice always begins with an ordinary person's choice. You don't need to be a governor or general. You just need willingness to say no to wrong and stand beside those too often left alone. Even a broke rancher can shift the weight of an entire land. Out west, where gunfire and dust decide fate, the one thing that endures isn't gold or land deeds. What remains is the voice of what's right. And once that voice is raised, even the wolves step back. Once again, I am truly honored to have shared this with you. Tell me what this story meant to you. Leave a comment below. Hit like if this story moved you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping tales of the wild frontier.